This lecture continues Byzantine art and the Golden Ages with the Middle and Late periods. Picking up where the last lecture left off, the Byzantines lost 2/3 of their territory to Arab Muslims, especially in the southeast, as they spread across the Middle East, spreading the name of Allah and Muhammad. Because this new heretical religion, as the Christians saw it, did not allow representational imagery in the religious structures, especially trying to represent Allah or Muhammad, iconoclasm is then going to be instituted in 726, a ban on religious imagery in churches altogether in the Orthodox Byzantine East. Leo III is going to explain why this could have happened, stating that God was punishing the Christian Roman Empire for their idolatry, for their violation of the second commandment, the prohibition of graven images. The familiar symbols of Christianity were instead used after the mosaics were removed from the interior of these Byzantine churches. Crosses and other symbols that are not representational took the place of images of Christ himself. In the Middle Byzantine period, from 843 to 1204, we have the repeal of iconoclasm until the Western Crusaders occupy Constantinople. In this period, we have Basil I, the emperor who restores the Roman Empire in the Great Renovation. He refurbishes the decorations that were defaced, destroyed, or neglected by the iconoclasts that came before him. We have an example of that in Hagia Sophia, where the Virgin Theotokos in Christ will be enthroned in an apse mosaic. Apses, of course, representing heaven. The gold surrounding the Mother of God on this throne and her Son, representing the heavenly aura that would reflect the light coming in from the various windows. She wears red shoes, again reserved for Roman emperors in the East. The inscription below this reads, "The pious emperors," that is Basil I, "replaced ones that the impostors or the iconoclasts had destroyed." Hence, defacing the image and the visage of Christ was seen as an attack on Christianity itself. Here we have a new eclecticism from the Greco-Roman naturalism that will be combined with that Byzantine penchant for flatness and sensation. Compared to the earlier Theotokos, we can see that the throne is at an angle to the so-called picture plane, and can be read as hovering in space. While at the same time, the drapery is even more schematic, not showing tonal variations from the highlights to the shadows as had earlier been blended haptically. Now we find there is an optic approach to the drapery. In architecture, several new churches are built to expand the Byzantine religion and empire in the middle period. Here, the monastery churches at Hosios Lukas are going to have structures that serve the monks in this monastery as well as the parish or the town surrounding them. The type of churches seen in the middle period are known as cross-in-square churches, for they are going to have a Greek cross inside a square plan. Now, in the middle period, we find that we no longer have plain brick facades or exteriors that were common in Christian decoration and architecture going back to Constantine, modeled on Roman basilicas. Now we find that they are going to be decorated like Islamic architecture, showing that they are influenced by this Eastern culture. The technique seen here in Hosios Lukas is going to be cloisonné, which is a term to describe light stones framing dark red bricks, giving us a much more engaged and dramatic facade, more in line with what was appreciated in the Near East. The plan itself contains several churches. Not only do we have the Church of the Mother of God, or the Theotokos, we have the Church of Hosios Lukas, and or the Church of St. Luke and Styrus. This is going to be the Middle Byzantine example that we will use to illustrate where architecture evolves and how it evolves. In the plan here of the Catholicon of Hosios Lukas, the central church, we have the Greek cross plan. Hence, we have equidistant arms of the nave and the transept. In this instance, and very commonly in the Middle Byzantine period, resting on squinches. Now, squinches are going to be a cube-like design that spreads the weight or distributes it more broadly along a cube on which a dome rests. Hence, it has thicker piers than pendentives and less windows. There is not as much space in between the arches. Therefore, not as much light can enter and penetrate the interior Middle Byzantine space. Here we still have the same terminology and vocabulary used for Christian churches, with the nave in the center, aisles off to the side, a transept crossing the nave, and then the apse where the high altar is. We even still retain the narthex or entryway to get into the aisles and nave proper. What changes, however, is the way in which we move our eye ascending upwards, as we have a cross and square plan, or circle once again inscribed within this cross. So we have repeated squares that move us up and up and up, until we eventually reach the circle of heaven. Circles are infinite. There is no beginning nor end. Therefore, they're going to represent heaven in its golden magnificence, with archangels surrounding Christ, who's holding a book, now bearded with his blessing of benediction. The interlocking spatial units here show squares within squares. Thus they get smaller, pulling us upward from scenes representing the life of Christ and the apostles below, up to him ascending into heaven and eternity. Now, the decorations of Hosios Lukas do not survive intact. For the best surviving Byzantine mosaics, we turn to the Church of the Dormition, Latin for sleep, because it is dedicated to the Ascension or Assumption of the Virgin. This is the best surviving and most famous Byzantine church because the mosaics actually survive intact, because at Daphne, Greece, it is isolated here in this provincial area. Culminating in a series of mosaics in the dome itself, we now have Christ as Pantocrator, and or as the Last Judge, the ruler of all, now shown bearded with deeply incised lines around his face and a frown carving his lips. He holds a bejeweled Bible here that would have been held by the priests below, and his hand no longer raises the two fingers, the middle and index finger, to bless us. It now is curled over. We retain in this instance the cruciform halo or equidistant halo that is going to show us that he is Christ, but now he is bearded and of course looks very suspiciously off to the left, his left we should state, which is where the damned are located. The damned of course are going to be the focus of his rage. But of course we must ask, why is he bearded? In the Western tradition, Christ's bearded appearance is going to be known from Veronica's veil, a relic that's going to be kept in the Vatican, where a woman named Veronica, according to this tradition, is going to offer a cloth to wipe Christ's face on the road to Calvary, and on the cloth appeared a miraculous image of Christ with a beard. Hence, from the early 8th century onward, Christ will be shown with a beard in the West, but especially in the Middle Byzantine period, for we find the Arabs are going to be gobbling up and eating Christian territory, and so we find Christ is going to be shown much more menacingly, threateningly judging. The iconography in Middle Byzantine churches will move from the areas below in the walls where the square is, representing the terrestrial sphere where we live. Thus, of course, time passes and people live and die. This gives way to the side apses and then finally the dome above, where there is no time. We enter into heaven. Here below, in the Middle Byzantine period, we're going to find a mixture of the classical organic structure that was so appreciated in the Greco-Roman era with the linearity and abstraction so loved by the Byzantines. Hence, they are going to outline the figures, the musculature, the drapery with very clear contours or outlines. The painterly figures within these outlines are going to suggest three-dimensional bulk to them as they angle and foreshortened against the picture plane. However, the backdrop is going to be solid gold. We only know that we are at Golgotha because of the skull below, where blood and water pour separately out of the wounds of Christ onto, because Golgotha, where Christ is crucified, literally means the place of skulls. Now, if we think about the earlier Theotokos in Hagia Sophia, we can see the eclectic approach brought together here as we suggest the monumental forms of the bodies of the Virgin Mary dressed in blue, looking at her dead son on the cross, while St. John the Evangelist off to the right is gesturing out at us. These bulky forms are going to also be incised and in front of a flat background. Thus we have the competing two-dimensionality and three-dimensionality in Byzantine art. The non-narrative aspect of the scene is not new. Going back to the very first representation of the crucifixion, we have this devotional and intercessory role emphasized here, not as though we have Roman soldiers surrounding him and or we are about to take him off the cross. Christ will always be on the cross, always dying for the sins of Christians in this instance, and so we always are going to contemplate his death. The Christus Patiens scene here, or the suffering Christ, is going to be the type which becomes more common when the lands of Christianity are attacked by Muslims. So too do we find that Christ is going to be shown suffering in the same way, dead with his head slumping down to the lower right, because that's where the saved are in the Last Judgment. They will be in the left-hand side of the composition, versus the damned in the right-hand side, as you see Christ judging above, looking towards the damned. Turning to the evolution in icons, we have them decorating the interiors of these Greek Orthodox churches on a new structure. We know that the clergy will display these icons in a hierarchical fashion on tiers known as templons or iconostases. Those are going to be the screens that divide us in the nave from the apse in the high altar. They are low columnar screens that are going to be added in the late Middle Byzantine period, seen here in the lower section at Kiev. On these screens, especially in the northeast and in Russia, we have several icons that develop that will be on the screen that we will periodically kneel and kiss towards. We have proskinesis, kissing towards. Here we have the most famous icon in Russia, known as the Vladimir Virgin, for it's from Vladimir, Russia, where we have again a virgin and child, or a Theotokos and child. This particular icon was believed to have saved all of Russia from the Tatar invasions and from the Poles in the 17th century. Its miraculous power would have been communicated as it was on the front gate and or marched into battle. Thus, of course, the Russians would have God on their side. In this particular icon, painted by a Byzantine artist, we have facial features that can be tied to Middle Byzantine types, such as a long, straight, narrow nose of the Virgin here, combined with a small mouth, whereas we have golden rays that radiate off of Christ's drapery here, and a flat silhouette set against a gold background. Now, you will note that in this instance, the Virgin holds the Christ child with her right hand and is going to gently caress him with her left. She presses her cheek against his. Thus we have the Virgin Eloisa, or the Virgin of Compassion, shown here, which is a much more tender and personal image that is preferred in Russia, where we find Orthodox Christianity spreads at this time. The Virgin appears somewhat melancholic, as we can see that she understands Christ will be sacrificed soon, and so, not surprisingly, she is going to understand and communicate that type of melancholic regret. Comparing it to other icons, we should note that we have a much more personal and direct engagement with the Mother of God as a mother, a maternal figure, and the Christ child that she is protecting, that she is coddling here. So therefore, we can access her as a mother who can intercede on our behalf with her Son, looking directly out at us here. And so now we have a direct engagement with the divine that is even more so than when icons began in the 6th century to be developed. The Middle Byzantine period saw building of new churches, not just in the Byzantine Empire proper, but also on the Italian peninsula. Here we have highlighted 3 important cities for the Republic of Venice as it rises. You have Constantinople, to the south Alexandria in Egypt, at the time dominated by Muslims, and then you have Venice in the Adriatic Sea in the lagoon to the north. Venice had been a Byzantine dependency until 751. When Ravenna fell to the Lombards, now we find that with the Byzantines out of the area and not dominant any longer, Venice becomes independent and will become ruled by doges, the Venetian term for a duke. It was in 829 that the Venetians decide to steal the body of Saint Mark in a holy theft from Alexandria, Egypt. They, of course, saw in a vision one of their priests that Saint Mark would want to lie under the stars of the Venetian lagoon. So they are going to transport his body in a barrel of pork to get him past Muslim customs. Then they build the first palace chapel and martyrium to him in 976. Doge Domenico Contarini is going to build the second shrine, which was begun in 1063, 2 decades into his rule as duke. Here we have the finished version of the second shrine that named St. Mark's for this apostle. The structure is actually modeled on the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, where we have a cruciform Greek cross plan, a central dome with 4 other domes over equal arms of this Greek cross, seen here. So we have extensive remodeling of this cathedral in the early 19th century in 1807, but there are a great deal of the original mosaics surviving going back to the 11th century. Here, if we compare it to the other Middle Byzantine churches of the day, you can see it is still a square and cross plan. Above, looking out onto the dome, we have a central dome with 4 other radiating domes off to the side in this equal Greek cross plan. Note that the domes, however, are not hemispherical. They are going to be teardrop shaped. This comes from Islamic architecture and mausoleums. On the interior, we have 40,000 square feet of mosaics, the central dome itself 80 feet high and 42 feet in diameter. Light through the windows at the base of all 5 domes gives the effect of that radiating ring of light, just like Procopius had noted with the Hagia Sophia. This reflects even more effectively with all of the mosaics, and we must remember originally that Hagia Sophia would also have been covered in these gold mosaics, giving us this spiritual iridescent shimmering light, or the physical appearance of and presence of God inside of the church. The inscriptions are going to be both in Latin and Greek, showing us that Venice is going to be the link between the East and the West. Their trading connections with Constantinople ensured the wealth and rise of this republic. In the domes and vaults, the figures in mosaics are going to be weightless. The Byzantine penchant for outlines and contours are even more noticeable here. And the permanence of showing these figures floating in these rings of light in heaven is going to be a very effective spiritual experience. Now, in the Fourth Crusade, even though the Venetians had done quite well trading with the Byzantines, they lead an attack to sack Constantinople. A Byzantine historian noted that they bear the cross of Christ on their shoulders, but even the Saracens or Muslims are kinder. In sacking the city, they bring back the spoils from Constantinople and put it on their cathedral. Here, decorated with the spoils from the sack of 1204, we have many things appended to the cathedral facade, including multiple colored columns at the base, the four-horse quadriga taken from the Hippodrome in Constantinople. This, as well as the portrait of the four tetrarchs, would come to decorate as spolia the Byzantine cathedral here, showing us the expanse and power of the Byzantines, as it is going to show us the material splendor with which the cultures they have conquered and appropriated will be illustrative here. Now, the last period of Byzantine art, or the last golden age, is going to last from 1261 to 1453, or the 2 centuries after recapturing Constantinople from the Fourth Crusade, to the loss, finally, to the Ottoman Turks, and the end of the Byzantine Empire. It was Michael VIII Palaiologos who would recapture Constantinople in 1261, reconstituting only a fragment of the previous empire. Seen here, the Ottoman Turks are going to control the Asian side of the Golden Horn, and then the Byzantines recapture only a small portion of the northern side, squeezed in between the Kingdom of Bulgaria and that of Servia. In one of these late Byzantine churches and decorations, the Church of Christ in Cora, which is now a museum, we have a series of frescoes which are much cheaper than mosaic, showing us that the resources the Byzantines had were far fewer in this late period. In this Paracclesian or side burial chapel, we have a very appropriate subject shown. The subject is very common in Byzantine art, but not so much in the West. It is called an anastasis, or a harrowing of hell, in which Christ is going to trample the doors of Hades. Once doing so, he is going to take from the tombs all of those that died before he was crucified. Often this shows the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, being pulled from their tombs, often showing John the Baptist, who was beheaded before Christ died by 6 months. We have the kings from the Old Testament, such as King David, a relative of Christ. King Solomon and other Old Testament prophets are often shown, as well as martyrs who died for the Christian faith before Christ could save them. In this eclectic approach, we have a spaceless atmosphere that does not suggest the weighty bulkiness of the figures. Instead, the drapery is now fluid and flat. There is no concern with systematic observation. The figures are shown from different angles and perspectives, recombined on this flat surface, where Christ appears, shimmering in white garb, surrounded by a white oval mandorla, interspersed with the starburst patterns or rosettes. Below him there are 2 doors along with broken locks, with the devil tied up that's going to be subdued Christ. Now in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, and the churches, like the Hagia Sophia, were converted to mosques to benefit this new civilization on the rise in the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire, however, does not fall completely. Russia becomes its heir and adopts Orthodox Christianity and the model of the Byzantine Empire. For, as it is stated, because the old Rome has fallen, and because the second Rome is now in the hands of the godless Turks, thy kingdom, O pious Tsar, is the third Rome. Hence, they are stating that you have Western European Rome, then the Byzantine version of Rome, and now Russia is the third Rome. Next time, we will continue on with the culture that displaces the Byzantines in the Middle East, that being Islam.